Buonasera, questo è il webinar di letteratura inglese di Mondadori Education e è un po' strano per me, ne ho fatti diversi, quindi saluto quelli con cui già ci conosciamo, che mi hanno scritto. È un po' strano perché non c'è Laura Cavaleri come al solito a presentare questo nostro incontro. Devo presentarmi io per ragioni molto semplici, cioè tutto lo staff delle lingue è impegnato in una riunione molto importante e quindi devo presentare me stesso. Non volendo annoiare voi anzitutto e me in primis, dirò semplicemente appunto che sono Arturo Cattaneo, insegno letteratura inglese in Università Cattolica qui a Milano, sono autore dei libri dei testi di letteratura inglese, antologie, soprattutto per le scuole superiori, e oggi vi parleremo insomma assieme di una cosa che riscuote molto interesse da parecchio tempo a questa parte, non solo per il testo più importante di cui parleremo, 1984, ma anche per i riflessi che questo ha avuto e ha tuttora sulla letteratura scientifica distopica o fantascientifica e utopica. Non essendo pratico di queste cose, spero di non dimenticare nulla. So che normalmente i materiali vengono forniti dopo qualche giorno e dovremmo fornirvi anche i 2 brevi racconti, molto brevi, distopici contemporanei, che sono oggetto del titolo, il Contemporary Dystopian Writing. Per cui io spero di aver esaurito la parte introduttiva nel modo corretto, evidentemente, e comincerei proprio con il nostro discorso e con le slide, per cui se possiamo cominciare con le slide. The title of our meeting today is Words Imagined and Feared, from Orwell's 1984 to Contemporary Dystopian Writing. Quite a wide subject, isn't it? And we might divide it into 2 parts. The first one concerns the most famous dystopian work in literature, that's Orwell's 1984. The second part will deal with 2 very short utopian tales or dystopian tales, and we might see quite a few interesting things about them. We start from 1984, a novel, and it's quite important to underline a novel. We'll see why. Then we'll see, however briefly, a modern science fiction classic, Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which came out in 1973, very well reviewed, winner of the Hugo Prize in, the following year, 1974. Then we're going to say a few words about N.K. Jemisin's short story, The Ones Who Stay and Fight, which from the title quite clearly is a contemporary reply to Le Guin. Why contemporary? Because this is 2018, so it's very close to us. And the short story, Jemisin's short story, pays homage to Le Guin's story, but it also questions it in ways which are quite interesting, I believe. And I want to start with the title, I said, because titles are very important. And in 1984, or for 1984, the one thing we see is a novel. Immediately, the subtitle, so to speak, What is Animal Farm was a fairy story. George Orwell wanted a novel to be prefixed from the very cover to 1984. On the other hand, why is it I cannot move the... Well, sorry. The very titles of the 2 short stories announce a theme. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is about people who walk away. We still don't know where from and where to, but it's people who walk away. And it's even more telling in a way, the title of a Jameson story, The Ones Who Stay and Fight. So it's about people who have to stay and fight. And starting with 1984, the novel, which came out in 1949, as we know, the main points about it usually are three. The future dystopic tyrannical society described in the novel, Big Brother, and telescreens, the omnipresence of telescreens. Of course, Big Brother and telescreens are linked together, and the two are linked to the dystopic society. The interesting thing for us, and for me, I've been working on that quite recently. What I'm telling you has been new for me as well, for until recently, in fact. And the film taken from the novel, the adaptation, came out in 1984. This is a very well-known film. Most of us know it, if not all of us. And it's about George Orwell's terrifying vision coming to the screen, as the title there says. The one thing that struck me is that to a few years ago, we might say, up to recently, quite recently, criticism on the novel 1984 was mainly based on the text, on the written text, on the novel, which is right, of course. But since in the novel, a great part of the story, a great part of the dystopian world, has to do with telescreens, television, technology. It's really interesting to take a look at these, how the novel is being put on screen as well. Now, as for the 1984 film, a title card at the end of the film explicitly states it was photographed in and around London during the period April-June 1984. The exact time and setting imagined by the author. And Michael Radford, when he wrote the script, was inspired by his idea to make a science fiction film made in 1948, by which he means that Orwell's novel, which was made in 1940, or written in 1948, was looking ahead to the future. But what kind of future? So it was a sort of science fiction film, but of a sort. Why of a sort? Because it has no spacecraft, as we know, no rockets, no planets, distant planets in the universe, but it's made in London, and in a world which is recognizably that of London right after World War II. Bombed outside, people queuing for bread, bread lines, and all that. Now, that's been called retrofuturism, which is a movement in the creative arts showing the influence of depictions of the future produced in an earlier era. So 1984, telling us about written in 1948, telling us about 1984. Retrofuturism. And to enhance that quality of retrofuturism, Michael Radford, and especially the cinematographer Roger Deakins, who was responsible for the photography, originally wanted to shoot the film in black and white. But the financial backers of the production, which were Virgin Films, opposed this idea. Quite clearly, in 1984, a black and white film wasn't supposed to be mainstream, and they wanted this to be mainstream, or at least to sell well, as all producers want. Instead, not being able to use black and white, Dickens used the film processing technique called bleach bypass to create the distinctive washed out look of the film's color visuals. Something, like the still we see here, which is quite peculiar to the film. In class, in our classroom, I believe, we might, convey that effect to our students by showing them a few slides, a few frames from the film, or a few minutes from the film, and the trailer, because the trailer is in full color, whereas the film is shot in this particular technique, bleach bypass, which is 50% black and white and 50% color, with a few technical devices. And let us consider the title of Orwell's novel. 1984. Why? Because it points to the future, which is not so common, come to think of it. How many dystopian works, how many, or even utopian works, look to the future, have a date in their title? Very, very few. So the question arises quite naturally: is 1984 a prophecy? No and yes, yes and no, no and yes. Why no? Because real life in 1984 was different. The life told in the novel and shown in Michael Radford's 1984 film looks more like that of London, Britain, right after World War II, as we said before. Nothing at all like the real life in London or in any other Western country at that time. But of course, yes, because telescreens are everywhere. Absolute control over people's lives and total lack of privacy or privacy. That's exactly what's happened. Not so much in 1984, and that is why the book is such a peculiar prophecy. It became true, very much true, some 15, 20 years later. And of course, it is true now. We have telescreens everywhere. We may not think that we are observed by Big Brother, uh, but our lack of privacy is quite clear, whether we like it or not, for better or for worse. So, as I was saying before, given that the prophetic quality of 1984 and its hold on readers and watchers and audiences has been so strong, immensely strong, in the past decades. I thought it was a bit strange that so little attention has been given to the films. 1984 in the Michael Radford, the one we just saw in the first place, but especially by two previous films or screen versions of the novel. In fact, the Michael Radford's film has a president in Britain, a 1956 film, Great Britain, black and white, directed by Michael Anderson. That's the poster. I hope you can read it. In the terrifying world of the future, will ecstasy be a crime? And it's quite telling that this being a film which was meant to, well, to sell well, like most films, the telescreen shows us Winston and Julia passionately kissing, which is not what happens exactly in the novel, as we know, but it's quite telling. And very interesting for us, the 1956 film begins with an announcement by a voiceover. And what does the voiceover say? After the devastation of the nuclear apocalypse of 1965, three great police states have divided the world between themselves: Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia. Well, the last part is quite clear. That's exactly what is described in 1984, the three big powers. But what about the very beginning of the film? After the devastation of the nuclear apocalypse of 1965, what nuclear apocalypse? And if we think that the film came out in 1956, quite clear, the trick of inverting the date, 1956 becomes 1965. Same trick which apparently Orwell did, writing in 1948 and calling his novel 1984, reversing the dates. Nuclear Apocalypse is 1984, the novel, concerned with the nuclear apocalypse, with the H bomb or the nuclear bomb? Well, not hardly at all. That just one passing remark about the bomb, atomic bomb, but nothing really important. That's clearly not the center of the novel. So why should they begin with this? That's a good question. And Orwell's the fact that Orwell was not interested in the atomic bomb, not in narrative terms, obviously, was very much concerned as a human being, as a citizen, but he didn't feel the need to put that into his novel. That's quite clear from an article he wrote for the Tribune in 1945, just right after the two atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in this quote, the bold sentences are mine, in the sense that I highlighted them. Orwell maintains that the bomb is not the great danger, the greatest danger for Orwell. Why not? Because it's very expensive and its manufacture demands an enormous industrial effort. And what he's concerned about is that the surface of the earth is being passed off into three great empires, and that the real danger for humanity in the future is not the bomb, not the atom bomb, nor any other weapons, as he says in this article that we can read on the screen, but that the world as a whole. In the world as a whole, he sees a drift for many decades, not towards anarchy, but towards the reimposition of slavery, which is exactly what he writes about in 1984, slavery especially through the telescreens. Now, might come as a surprise that the 1956 film, the British film, had been preceded by a BBC adaptation in 1954, so 2 years before that, starring Peter Cushing, a very famous actor at that time, Donald Pleasence, another good actor. But we're more concerned here with the impact of television on viewers and the public. At that time, this is Big Brother in the film, in the BBC version. And again, the BBC version, in 1954, mind you, also begins with an announcement, again by voiceover, which sums up the series of catastrophic events that have brought about the world in 1984. And this is how it begins. The atomic war, famine, revolution, the collapse of civilization have brought us to this state of affair. So here again, the atomic war is in the forefront, which tells us that that's the way the 1984 the novel has been read and given to the big public, much wider audiences than reading public, for at least 20 years, if not more than that, during the so-called Cold War. The novel, was mainly read not so much for the telescreens, but in terms of Cold War, for the danger of a nuclear war. And of course, the novel was mainly read as an indictment against communism, Big Brother being Stalin. The analogy was quite often put forward. We have to bear in mind the impact that television has in the early 1950s. The first great event in the UK was the live covering of Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953, seen by 20 million people in the UK. Amazing, isn't it? 20 million people. And of course, not all of them had a TV set. Few of them actually had a TV set. So they gathered in public places to see the coronation. And surprisingly, maybe more, given predictably less impact that 1984 might have on the public. The BBC version of 1984 was broadcast on 12 and 16 December 1954, and that was seen by 7 million people, which is quite a lot, isn't it? Even by today's standards. And the broadcast caused great scandal because of the shock caused by some scenes, not so much love scenes, but the rat's torture, especially in room 101, the famous rat's torture. And so popular was this 1984 broadcast by the BBC that 3 weeks later, a TV parody in 1985 was broadcast, where Big Brother becomes the Big Brother Corporation, BBC. And surprise, surprise, the British were not the first to put 1984 on screen. The Americans came first the year before that, 1953. And they broadcast that version on the CBS anthology TV series Westinghouse Studio Ones, which is a particular program because it was sponsored by Westinghouse, and it was one of those programs meant to sell things, Westinghouse apparatuses in that case. So they would show the audience a classic in world literature, in this case 1984, and within that the program advertising would be broadcast as well. Quite an unlike venue for 1984 maybe, but the interesting thing is that in the CBS American version 1984, the blame for the future dystopian world is not laid on the atomic war, but surprisingly on the technological innovation brought about by television. A voiceover, again, introduces the story with these words: with the development of television, our private lives are over. In every room, in every street, there are telescreens that can see every movement and hear every word. Well, surprising, isn't it? The television uh, telling the audience, its audience, viewers, beware of television because our private lives are over, which is exactly what happens in 1984. So, in a way, this American CBS version is closer to the novel than the later British version, which were more centered on the atomic danger. And for me, it was quite a surprise. But going back to the 1984, the real year, 1984, it's even more surprising, perhaps, to realize that the Michael Radford's film had been preceded at the very beginning of the year, the 22nd of January 1984, by a Macintosh launch of a TV commercial during the Super Bowl, uh, and the advertising, because that it was a piece of advertising, was directed by Ridley Scott, who just 2 years before had directed Blade Runner. So he was the man to talk about and direct such things. What happens is that in 1984, at the beginning, there's a launch of the Macintosh computer, which had been preceded in 1983, at the end of the year, by Steve Jobs' keynote address. And to his people, he read the following story before showcasing a preview of the commercial, the same commercial that would be shown during the Super Bowl a month later. And these are the words of Steve Jobs. It is now 1984. It appears IBM wants it all. Apple is perceived to be the only hope to offer IBM a run for its money, to be its rival. Dealers initially welcoming IBM with open arms now fear an IBM dominated and controlled future. They are increasingly turning back to Apple as the only force that can ensure their future freedom. IBM wants it all and is aiming its guns on its last obstacle to industry control: Apple. Will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry, the entire information age? Was George Orwell right about 1984? Surprising, isn't it? Of course, the Macintosh launch meant that from then on, we could read and be connected to the internet through our computers. And in the end, the computers, like our laptops today, our mobile phones today, could see us, talk to us, do things the same things which are described in Always 1984. But the launch of the Macintosh computer is perceived and advertised by Steve Jobs and the Apple as a form of liberation from the word uh, of 1984, the word that, according to them, IBM was forcing. By the way, Big Blue is the nickname of IBM. And the commercial, we can still find it. You can still find it on the internet, on YouTube, so we can easily show our students or refer them to that. Notice how the uh, ugly figure on screen in that short commercial for the launch of Macintosh has bluish color, the color of IBM. And the tagline was, on January 24, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you see why 1984 won't be like 1984. Now, how that is true, how that has turned out true, it's open to question, obviously, but it's quite interesting that the era of modern computers and the era of control, telescreen controls over our lives, is heralded by 1984. And this is about the first part of our talk today, because I believe that our next slide will take us to, well, much closer actually, to the two short stories, dystopian short stories written, or utopian dystopian short stories written by these two writers, female writers, American, both of them. Ursula K. Le Guin is the author of 23 novels, 12 collection of short stories. There's an S missing there. Poetry, books for children. So a very prolific and very good writer. Whereas Jamieson was the first writer to have won 3 consecutive Hugo Prizes for Best Novel. She's best known for a trilogy, Broken Earth. And her works move from fantasy to science fiction. Themes include the bad effects, pernicious effects of climate change, racism and violence, social and climate injustice. So it's all very, very up to date, unfortunately, very contemporary, very close to us. And they represent what has been called critical utopia, which is an interesting variant on classical utopia, because, of course, one big difference is that up to the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, we tend to have mostly utopian works, utopias, and very few dystopias. From the beginning of the 19th century onwards, we have many more dystopias than utopias, including science fiction, which is often dystopian. So it's quite a far cry from Thomas More's utopias or other famous works in the past, as if writers and people did not believe in utopias any longer. But the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, especially in America, fostered a revival of utopian literature in a different form, quite interesting for us and for our students, I believe, called critical utopia. And there's a very good essay by Tom Moylan, Demand the Impossible. The title itself tells us that these writers want to believe in utopia without losing their awareness that the world is not perfect, far from it. So this is a quote from Demand the Impossible. A central preoccupation of critical utopias is the realization of the limits of the utopian tradition. We can't believe in them any longer, not 100%, maybe not even 50%. So that these texts, critical utopia, refuse utopia as a project. How could we today? While keeping it as a dream, something about which we'll come back later on. Now, the first of our two short stories, very short, the ones who walk away from Omelas is very short. That's why I believe, we can give it to our students quite easily, and the language too is fairly simple. The ones who walk away from Omelas is peculiar. It has no real plot. It's a short philosophical tale set during a summer festival held in the city of Omelas. And Omelas is, to all appearances, a perfect utopian world. It has no king, army, priesthood, slaves, no stock exchange, no police force. Its happiness and prosperity, however, depend on the continuous suffering of a single child. These are the words used by Le Guin. Omelas sounds like a city in a fairy tale, as your own fancy bids, as you wish. For certainly I cannot suit you all. In other words, what's your idea of utopia? That's it. You can imagine. But their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest and the kindly weathers of the skies, depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. So there's just one child who suffers. And he suffers in a room, again a quote from the short story. The room is about 3 paces long and 2 wide, a mere broom closet or disused tool room. In the room, child is sitting. It could be a boy or a girl, doesn't really matter. It looks about 6, but actually is near 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, and neglect. And on the suffering and isolation of that single child, the happiness and prosperity of the whole world, this perfect utopia, rests. Now, Le Guin has repeatedly affirmed to have been influenced by a passage in an essay by William James, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, which came out in 1891. William James, of course, the one who wrote about also the stream of consciousness. The famous definitions come from him, as we very well know. And the subtitle of Le Guin's story, in fact, reads Variations on a Theme by William James. And in that essay, James invites us to reflect on how much ideals of good and evil may be based on their association with bodily pleasure, what is good for us, and relief from pain, and how horrible and immoral it would be if our happiness and prosperity were due to the suffering of one single individual. Quite clearly, it's a philosophical question. In the Enlightenment age already, it was posited. William James restates and Le Guin writes about it. And this is how she ends her short story. At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who go to see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not in fact go home at all. Because every inhabitant in the city, in that perfect utopia, has to see that at least once. So they must be aware of what their happiness depends on. Sometimes also a man or a woman much older falls silent for a day or two, and then leaves home. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Each one they go west or north, towards the mountains. They go on. They live homeless. They walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it all. It is possible that it does not exist. But they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from homeless. And this is the very end of the story. So some people refuse to stay where happiness depends on the suffering of one person. The story ends with an implicit request to make a choice, to decide which side we are on. Omela stands clearly for our privileged world, in which a high standard of living is made possible by the exploitation of natural and human resources in the less privileged areas of the world. The suffering child recalls the sweatshops in the first place, where women and children slave away for a minimum pay. But the story also lends itself to an ecological reading. It denounces the false idea that nature is at the service of mankind, and it denounces its exploitation for a labor force whose sufferings and hardships are kept from our knowledge, unless we decide to look and see, which is exactly what Le Guin's short story invites us to do. And this is so much for the first short stories, the ones who walk away from Omelas. So in that title, in the first title, we have people who walk away to refuse to stay, but it doesn't really say what to do. The title of Jamieson's story is really more, well, I was going to say promising, which is not the right word, I'm afraid, but it does posit a decision, the ones who stay and fight, not walk away. So it seems to be the opposite. And that there's that word fight, which is pretty demanding. And most of these words are quoted from Jameson. She acknowledges that this story is about one of the ones who walked away from Omelas. It is clearly a pastiche and a reaction to Le Guin's story. And she said, Jameson said her story in another utopia called Helat, where life is characterized by kindness and genuine pleasure. People live long and richly with good health for as long as fate and choice of medicine permits. Every child knows opportunity, every parent has a life. And so this is Helat, a city whose inhabitants simply care for one another. That is a city's purpose, they believe, not merely to generate revenue or energy or products, but to shelter and nurture the people who do these things. This is, again, these are Jameson's words. This is Helat, after all, and not that barbaric America where she belongs to. This is not Omelas either, a tick of a city, fat and happy with his head buried in a tortured child. But, there's a but, and here comes the rub, as Hamlet says, Helat has been a worse place, after all, in its past. So that perfect utopia has a past, and the past is very much our own world. The city had a different civilization once, one which might not have upset you so, for this word was once our word. It was not so much parallel as the same. But even the city imagined by Jameson is founded on a pact, shared and accepted by its inhabitants. Upon coming of age, young citizens are informed of the past of injustice and inequality of our society, of the violence and hatred that characterize our present, which is their past. So the present, the utopia of the present, has a past. And in that past, of course, inequality, injustice were ripe, omnipresent. And here too, people have to know at least once. Just as in Omelas, people are shown the child upon whose unhappiness their happiness depends, so in Hela, they are made aware of the systematic violence of our society, where some people are valued and others are not valued, where humanity is granted for some and not for others. And that's the problem. And let's see together how Jameson ends her own story and see in parallel with the other one. And now we come to you, my friend. Now you might finally be able to envision a world where people have learned to love, as they learned in our world to hate. Perhaps you will speak of Hela to others and spread the notion farther still. It's possible. Everyone, even the poor, even the lazy, even the undesirable, can matter. Do you see how just the idea of this provokes utter rage in some? That is the infection defending itself. Because if enough of us believe a thing is possible, then it becomes so. So don't walk away. The child needs you too, don't you see? You also have to fight for her now that you know she exists, or walking away is meaningless. And that's the real answer or contrast to walking away from homeless. Here is my hand, take it. Please, good, good. Now, let's get to work. Now, quite clearly, this is, in a way, sort of militant writing. We see how, in this ending, critical utopia shows itself. Um, so we still believe, well, some writers obviously still believe in utopia, but at certain conditions. And the condition is not to find a ready made perfect world, but to fight for it, maybe, as the title entails, or to work for it. Let's get to work, which is the last work or last sentence of the short story. So much for utopia. And I wish to finish with something which very much attaches to, in my view at least, to critical utopia. A quote from Eduardo Galeano, Parole in Cammino. It was originally written in Spanish, so I saw no reason for translating into English. And it's about utopia. Lei è all'orizzonte, mi avvicino di 2 passi, lei si allontana di 2 passi. Cammino per 10 passi e l'orizzonte si sposta di 10 passi più in là. Per quanto io cammini, non la raggiungerò mai. A cosa serve l'utopia? Serve proprio a questo, a camminare. Well, thank you for your attention. And well, we've been talking about quite a few things. And now I see if there are any questions and if I can answer them. Obviously, I'm not totally sure about one. One's never 100% sure, obviously, to be able to answer other people's questions. So there's one. Well, there's a few actually. The first one, I don't know. I confess, I don't know how to answer. Does homeless have any meaning? I don't know. I haven't found it. I must say that I'm not an expert in critical utopia. I've come to know it, and I've come to be very interested in that. And I've talked to people and worked with people who are experts on that. As far as I know, no, it's got no meaning. But usually, well, not usually, but often, the utopian words or dystopian words do not have precise meaning. Sometimes they do. Obviously, Utopia has the founding, or Erewhon, for instance, Samuel Butler, Erewhon, which is an anagram of nowhere. But I'm afraid I cannot answer that. I really don't know. I don't think it has any meaning, but don't take my words for gospel. I have a good look anyway. Well, there's another one which I don't know how to answer. Laura Cavalieri should be here, I'm afraid. Is it possible to rewatch this lesson and the previous one about Dickens in some way? As far as I'm concerned, I'd be glad to, but of course, you have to interact with Mondadori. Then there's another one, quite a complex one, in Italian. Come si interlaccia la tradizione distopica di Orwell con Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep e la tradizione fantascientifica e distopica di Ballard e Huxley o Aldis? Questo è un po' più complesso, c'è parecchio qui. Io comincerei a dire, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep ha a che fare con un futuro in cui soprattutto il vero problema è nasce dai robot o dagli androidi, che dir si voglia. Di per sé io lo legherei più al Frankenstein. È stato notato come il Frankenstein di Mary Shelley è il primo vero robot, ancora il nome non è conosciuto, non è nato, non è stato inventato o trasposto. Le leggi della robotica di Asimov ancora non c'erano più di 100 anni, però Frankenstein è sostanzialmente un robot, una creazione totalmente non umana, che rappresenta un pericolo, come appunto gli androidi. La differenza tra Frankenstein e la short story di Dick e il film, è soprattutto che mentre in Frankenstein la creatura che noi chiamiamo mostro, a volte chiamano mostro anche nel libro, lo sappiamo, è riconoscibile come appunto un pericolo, qualcosa di mostruoso, nessuno vuole vederlo, perché gli sforzi di quella scienza sono imperfetti. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep abbiamo esattamente il contrario, il problema è distinguere l'artificiale dal naturale e l'artificiale cerca di prendere il sopravvento. Ecco, quindi da questo punto di vista non mi sembra che il raffronto con 1984, con Orwell sia così netto, se non per il fatto appunto che entrambe le opere hanno, e il film, hanno una prevalenza fortissima della tecnologia, che tende a schiavizzare l'uomo, ecco, questo sì. Per quanto riguarda le altre domande, beh, la seconda parte della domanda, cioè come si lega per esempio a Huxley o ad altri autori, ma Orwell è un po' un caso a sé stante, perché arriva a questa distopia che ci pensiamo soprattutto perché autori come Ballard, Dick, Huxley sono più legati alla fantascienza ovviamente, che è una forma di distopia per come è attuata nelle loro opere. Però Orwell, stranamente, nonostante faccia una profezia nel titolo, metta una data futura nel titolo, chiaramente non vuole fare quello che fa per esempio Huxley in Brave New World, che nonostante dia un titolo shakespeariano, quindi che guarda al passato, a tutta una tradizione classica, ambienta la sua storia nel 2500 e qualcosa, quindi chiaramente in un mondo fantascientifico molto più avanti. Orwell poteva benissimo prevedere, sapeva che molti dei suoi lettori sarebbero arrivati al 1984, ma soprattutto il libro, Il mondo descritto nel 1984 non ha niente di fantascientifico, non ha niente di scientifico, tranne questa straordinaria, non c'è la bomba atomica, e Huxley lo rimprovera per quello, gli dice: "Ma com'è possibile non aver Huxley rimprovera se stesso nella seconda edizione degli anni '40 di Brave New World, che esce negli anni '30, dice: "Mi rimprovero, io che conosco un po' di scienza, di non aver parlato abbastanza del pericolo atomico, che già negli anni '30 era chiaro, ancora prima che si riuscisse a creare la bomba". Però in Orwell non c'è niente di questo, pochissimo. E il film 1984, quello di Radford del 1984, lo fa vedere bene. È un mondo letteralmente da Londra sotto i bombardamenti della seconda guerra mondiale, di rovine, di code per il pane, un mondo che non ha niente di futuro, di futuribile. Quindi dal mio punto di vista 1984 rappresenta un unicum nella letteratura, nella letteratura distopica. Ed è questa probabilmente anche la ragione del suo grande successo. Un'altra domanda, forse abbiamo ancora qualche minuto, mi dicono. Is there an essay book you would suggest about the relationship between artificial intelligence and Frankenstein? Have you written an article about it? No, I haven't written an article about it. I'm rewriting Mary Shelley and the Frankenstein thing for our next anthology of English literature. But if you want, talking that, if you want if anyone wants a good introduction to that, the Norton Critical Edition of Frankenstein has quite a few interesting things to say about that, about science and the new science. Frankenstein, of course, is the relevant work, the relevant work, even for dystopian discourses. It's not usually or not so commonly, at least among dystopian works, but I believe that it's got a lot to do in that respect. For the exploitation of nature, the extreme attempts of science to reproduce life or to conquer the secret of life. So I think it's central work in that. Okay. Well, another question was about could you expand on what you said about 1984 as a prophecy? In what sense? Well, I just answered that, I think. So, well, I believe this is it. Well, thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And my regret is, as always, is that we don't see each other. Who knows? Maybe one of these days in a very big audience might be possible. So this is for today, and we'll call it a day, as the English say. And I hope to see you. Spero di vedervi ancora presto. Buon lavoro a tutti. E speriamo appunto che l'utopia critica apra qualche strada per noi, per il mondo, che ne ha molto bisogno. Grazie allora e arrivederci.